Bible stories. Moses, David, Daniel, Jesus, Noah. Welcome to my channel.
There are moments when history does not collapse slowly, when it does not give warning, when it does not unfold in a way that allows people to prepare or adjust or escape. It simply breaks. Completely, irreversibly. And in that single moment, everything that once felt permanent is revealed to be fragile. Everything that once felt secure is exposed as temporary. And those who stood at the center of power suddenly find themselves standing at the edge of nothing. This is where the story begins. Not with a rise, not with hope, but with a fall so sudden that it reshaped the lives of everyone connected to it. Especially one child who would never understand it in the moment, but would carry its consequences for the rest of his life. The battlefield was still, not silent, but heavy. The kind of stillness that follows violence, when the sound of battle fades but its impact remains, when the ground itself feels like it remembers what has just taken place. Saul, the first king of Israel, had fallen. His sons had fallen with him. The line of power that once defined a nation had been broken in a single day, and the ripple effect of that moment moved quickly. Far beyond the battlefield, into homes, into cities, into places where the news had not yet arrived but would soon change everything. Because when a king falls, everything connected to him becomes vulnerable. The palace was no longer a place of security, it was a target. Those who had once served with confidence now moved with fear, not because they had done something wrong, but because they were associated with something that had just lost its power. In ancient times, when one dynasty replaced another, survival was not guaranteed for those who belonged to the previous line. It was not uncommon for entire families to be erased, not out of personal hatred, but out of political necessity, to eliminate any threat, any possibility of a future claim, any lingering connection that might challenge what was about to be established. And somewhere inside that collapsing world, there was a child. He was only 5 years old. Too young to understand war, too young to grasp politics, too young to comprehend what it meant for a kingdom to fall, but not too young to be affected by it. His name was Mephibosheth, and in that moment, he was not thinking about kings or thrones or power. He was simply a child, living within a system he did not choose, protected by structures he did not create, unaware that everything around him was about to change in a way he could never undo. The news arrived. It did not come gently. It did not wait for the right moment. It came with urgency, with fear, with the kind of intensity that forces immediate action without time for explanation. Saul was dead. Jonathan was dead. The army had been defeated. The enemy was advancing. And in the chaos of that realization, decisions had to be made quickly. Movements had to happen immediately. And those responsible for the child understood what this meant. They had to run, not later, not after planning now, because staying meant risk, and risk in that moment meant death. His nurse took him. She did not stop to gather belongings. She did not pause to consider alternatives. She acted instinctively, desperately, because she knew what was at stake. The palace that had once been a place of safety had become a place of danger, and the only option was escape, movement, distance from what was coming. She lifted him, held him close, and began to flee, moving as quickly as she could. Driven not by clarity but by fear, by the urgency of a situation that did not allow for careful steps or controlled decisions. And then, it happened. In the rush, in the panic, in the urgency of escape, she fell. It was not intentional, not planned, not something she could correct once it began. One misstep, one moment of imbalance, 1 second where everything shifted, and the child fell with her. That the impact changed everything. Not in a way that could be seen immediately, not in a way that could be reversed with time, but in a way that would define the rest of his life. He was injured severely, permanently. His legs would never function the same again. He would never run, never walk normally, never move through the world the way he was meant to. And in that single moment, as the kingdom fell around him, something else fell within him. Something that could not be restored, something that would follow him into every stage of his life, shaping not only how he moved but how he was seen, how he was treated, how he understood himself. He was carried away, not as a prince, but as a child marked by loss of family, loss of position, loss of ability, loss of future as it had once been imagined. and the world did not stop to acknowledge it. The war continued. The transition of power moved forward. David rose, a new king, a new direction, a new chapter for the nation. But for Mephibosheth, there was no new beginning, only survival, only hiding, only the slow realization, as he grew older, that the life he might have had was gone before he even understood what it was. Because children grow into awareness. They begin to see what others see. They begin to understand what has happened to them. Not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, as the world reflects their condition back to them. And for Mephibosheth, that reflection would not be kind. He would come to understand that he was not just different, but limited. Not just injured, but dependent. Not just part of a fallen house, but a reminder of it. The name of his grandfather still carried weight, but not the kind that brings honor, the kind that brings danger, because he was connected to soul, connected to a line that had been replaced, connected to a past that could not return. And in that connection there was risk, not constant, not always visible, but present enough to shape decisions, to influence where he lived, how visible he allowed himself to be, because survival, for someone in his position, was not just about staying alive, it was about staying unnoticed. And that is where the transformation becomes complete. From prince to refugee, from potential heir to hidden survivor, from strength to weakness, all in one day, all in one moment, all before he had the ability to understand it. And the tragedy of that moment is not just what was lost, but how quietly it happened after. How the world moved forward, how the story of a fallen king became history, how a new king began to establish his rule, how life continued for everyone else while one child grew up carrying the weight of something he did not choose, something he did not cause, something he did not change. This is how stories like his begin. Not with recognition, not with attention, but with silence, with disappearance, with a life that slips out of view, not because it lacks importance, but because it no longer fits into the narrative of power and victory and progress. Mephibosheth did not die that day, but something in his life did, and what remained would have to learn how to exist in a world that had already moved on without him. But the fall of a house is never the end of its story, because sometimes what is broken, what is hidden, what is forgotten, is still remembered by someone, and when that moment comes, everything changes again. There is a difference between something that happens to you and something that becomes part of you, because a moment can pass and fade into memory, but when that moment leaves a mark that reshapes how you move, how you are seen, and how you understand yourself, it does not remain in the past. It follows you, it grows with you, it becomes something you carry into every day that comes after. And for Mephibosheth, the fall was not just an event that ended when he hit the ground. It was the beginning of a life that would never move the same way again. A life that would constantly remind him of what had been lost before he even had the chance to understand it. And as he grew, he did not grow away from that moment. He grew into it, into the limitations it created, into the awareness it forced upon him, into a reality where the simplest things, the things most people never think about, became constant reminders that something about him was different, that something about him had been permanently altered, because children run, they move without thinking, they chase, they fall and get back up, they exist in motion without awareness of it. But for him, movement was no longer instinctive. It was something he had to think about, something that required effort, something that revealed itself every time he tried to do what others did naturally, and over time, that difference becomes impossible to ignore, not because someone explains it in a single moment, but because it is experienced repeatedly, in small ways, in quiet realizations, in the growing understanding that he could not keep up, could not move freely, could not escape the reality of his own body. And with that realization comes something deeper than frustration, something that settles into the way a person sees themselves. A quiet question that does not always have words at first but grows clearer over time. Why am I like this? Why can I not do what others do? Why does my body not respond the way it should? And the answer, when it begins to form, is not comforting, because it is tied to a moment he cannot remember clearly but feels the consequences of every day. A fall that changed everything, an injury that would not heal, a past that cannot be undone, and as that understanding grows, so does the awareness of how others see him, Not always with cruelty, not always with intention, but with difference, with adjustment, with a quiet shift in expectation, because people respond to what they see, and what they see in him is not strength, not ability, not potential in the way they would see it in others, but limitation, something that needs help, something that must be carried, something that cannot stand on its own. And while that help may come from care, it also carries something else, something that slowly shapes how he understands his place in the world. Because when you are always helped, always carried, always protected, you begin to internalize what that means. You begin to see yourself through the same lens, not as someone who leads or stands or acts, but as someone who depends, someone who follows, someone who exists within the boundaries others set for you. And over time, that becomes identity, not just a condition, not just a circumstance, but a way of seeing yourself that feels fixed, unchangeable, permanent. And for Mephibosheth, that identity is shaped not only by his body but by his name, by the family he belongs to, by the history he carries without choosing it, because he is not just a child with an injury, he is the grandson of Saul, and that connection carries weight, not the kind that brings honor, but the kind that brings risk. Because in a world where kings rise and fall through conflict, where power shifts are secured by removing threats, being part of a previous royal line is not safety. It is exposure. It is a reason to be watched, a reason to be feared, a reason to be eliminated. And even as time passes, even as David establishes his rule, even as the nation begins to stabilize, that underlying reality does not disappear completely. It lingers, shaping decisions, influencing where he can live, how visible he can be, how much attention he can allow himself to attract, because survival, for someone in his position, is not about growth or ambition. It is about caution, about staying out of sight, about avoiding anything that might draw attention to the fact that he still exists, that he is still connected to a line that once held power, and so his life becomes defined by avoidance, by limitation, by the careful navigation of a world where his name and his condition both place him in a position of weakness. And weakness in that kind of environment is dangerous. It is not something that is easily protected, it is something that must be hidden. And so he learns to live that way, not in open spaces but in quiet ones, not in the center but on the edges, not where he can be seen but where he can remain unnoticed. And in that way of living, something begins to happen internally, something that is not immediately visible but becomes deeply rooted over time. Because when a person lives long enough in hiding, when they spend enough time avoiding attention, avoiding risk, avoiding expectation, they begin to believe that this is where they belong, that this is all their life will ever be, that the limitations they experience are not temporary but permanent, not situational but defining. And so identity narrows, it becomes smaller, more contained, more restricted, until it is shaped almost entirely by what cannot be done rather than what can, by what must be avoided rather than what can be pursued. And in that narrowing, hope begins to fade, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but gradually, as the evidence of daily life reinforces the same message over and over again. This is who you are, this is what your life is, this is what you can expect. And when that message is repeated long enough, it becomes something that feels true, something that is no longer questioned, something that defines the way the future is imagined, or rather, not imagined at all. Because when a person learns to expect very little, they stop looking beyond what is immediately in front of them. They stop considering possibilities that feel out of reach. They stop hoping for change that has never been seen, and instead, they focus on survival, on maintaining what little stability they have, on staying within the boundaries that feel safe, even if those boundaries are restrictive, even if they come at the cost of everything else. And for Mephibosheth, the inability to run is not just about movement, it is about what that movement represents. Because running is freedom, it is escape, it is the ability to respond quickly when danger comes, to move away from what threatens, to pursue what is ahead. And without that ability, every situation must be approached differently, every risk must be calculated more carefully, every decision must account for the fact that he cannot respond the way others can, that he will always be slower, always be more vulnerable, always be at a disadvantage in ways that cannot be ignored. And that awareness shapes everything. It changes how he thinks, how he prepares, how he reacts. It teaches him to expect less, to hope less, to remain where it is safe. Even if that safety is built on isolation, even if it means living a life that is far removed from what might have been possible under different circumstances. And yet, even within that life, even within that limitation, even within that quiet hidden existence, there are things that remain beyond his awareness, things that have not been erased, connections that have not been broken, promises that have not been forgotten. And though he does not see them, though he does not expect them, though nothing in his current reality suggests that anything will change, those unseen threads are still there, still moving, still shaping a future he cannot yet imagine. Because sometimes the most significant turning points do not begin in the life of the person who will be changed, but somewhere else entirely, in a memory, in a promise, in a decision made by someone who has not forgotten what others have. And when that decision begins to take form, it will reach into the life of a man who has learned to expect nothing, and it will call him into something he never believed was possible. Fear does not always arrive suddenly. It does not always come in a single moment that can be clearly identified and named. Sometimes it builds slowly, shaped by memory, by circumstance, by the quiet awareness of what could happen even if it has not yet happened. And for Mephibosheth, fear was not something that needed to be explained to him in words. It was something he grew into, something that formed around him as he began to understand the world he was living in, a world where his name carried weight, where his past was not just history but a potential threat, where his existence alone could be enough to place him in danger. And that kind of fear does not need constant reminders. It settles into the background, shaping decisions before they are even fully formed, guiding movement without needing to be spoken out loud, becoming part of the way a person lives without ever needing to be acknowledged directly. He learned to stay hidden, not because someone gave him a rule that said he must, but because everything around him suggested that it was the safest way to survive. Because visibility brings attention, and attention, in his situation, was not something to seek, it was something to avoid, something that could lead to questions, and questions could lead to recognition, and recognition could lead to consequences that he would not be able to escape from, not with his body, not with his position, not with his lack of protection. And so hiding was not just a choice. It became instinct, something that shaped how he moved through the world, where he allowed himself to go, who he allowed himself to be seen by, how much of himself he allowed others to notice. He lived in the shadow of a name, Saul, a name that once commanded authority, that once represented leadership, that once defined a kingdom, but now carried a different kind of meaning, one that was tied to what had been lost, to what had been replaced, to what no longer existed in the same way. And for most people, that shift might simply be history, something to remember but not something that affects daily life. But for Mephibosheth it was different, because he was not separate from that name. He was connected to it, directly, permanently, and in a world where power was secured by eliminating threats, that connection mattered in ways that could not be ignored. Even if David was not actively seeking to destroy Saul's descendants, even if there was no immediate danger moving toward him, the possibility alone was enough, because survival is not based only on what is happening, it is shaped by what could happen. By the understanding that circumstances can change quickly, that decisions can be made without warning, that a life can be taken not because of something you have done, but because of who you are connected to. And for someone in his position, that awareness creates a kind of tension that never fully disappears, a constant need to remain cautious, to avoid anything that might shift attention in his direction. So he remained out of sight, not in the places where people gathered, not in spaces where names were spoken openly, not where stories of the past were discussed, because in those places, recognition becomes more likely. And recognition is not neutral, it carries weight, it carries risk, it carries the possibility of exposure. And exposure, for him, is not something he can recover from easily, not something he can outrun, not something he can fight against. And so the safest place becomes the place where he is least likely to be noticed at all. This is how isolation begins, not always forced, not always imposed from the outside, but chosen, gradually, as the most logical response to a situation that offers no better alternative. And over time, that isolation becomes normal. It becomes familiar. It becomes the environment in which a person lives, thinks, and understands themselves. And the longer it continues, the more it shapes identity. Because when you spend enough time removed from others, when you exist in spaces where you are not seen, not known, not acknowledged, you begin to internalize that absence. You begin to believe that this is where you belong, that this is what your life is meant to be. He lived in Lodi, a place that carried its own meaning. Not a city of importance. Not a place of wealth or influence. Not somewhere people look toward with expectation. It was distant, quiet, forgotten, and in many ways it reflected his own life, not by coincidence but by necessity, because places like that are where people go when they need to disappear, when they need to exist without drawing attention, when they need to remain outside the structures that define power and visibility. And for Mephibosheth, that kind of place offered something he could not find elsewhere, not opportunity, not growth, but safety, a form of protection that comes not from strength but from obscurity. He became part of that obscurity, a man who was once connected to a throne now living in a place that held no significance, no influence, no recognition, and over time, that contrast does something to the way a person understands their own story, because the distance between what might have been and what is becomes more apparent, more defined, more difficult to ignore, and yet, at the same time, it begins to feel permanent. Because when a person lives in a certain reality long enough, it no longer feels temporary, it feels fixed, it feels like the final version of their life. He did not expect to be found. He did not expect to be remembered. He did not expect anything beyond what he already knew, because expectation requires evidence. It requires some indication that change is possible, that something different could happen, that the future might not look exactly like the present, and for him, there was no such indication. Nothing in his daily life suggested that anything would shift, nothing pointed toward a different outcome. And so he settled into what was in front of him, not out of contentment, but out of necessity. Because when a person learns that hope is unlikely, they begin to protect themselves from it. They begin to lower their expectations, to avoid disappointment, to accept what is rather than risk imagining what could be. And yet, even in that acceptance, fear does not disappear. It remains quiet, constant, not always at the front of his mind, but never fully gone, because the possibility of danger still exists, even if it is not immediate, even if it has not yet arrived, and that possibility shapes the way he lives, the way he thinks, the way he prepares. It keeps him cautious. It keeps him aware. It keeps him from stepping too far outside the boundaries that have kept him safe so far. This is what it means to live in hiding. Not just to be unseen, but to structure your entire life around the idea that being seen could change everything, to measure every action against the risk it might carry, to choose silence over attention, distance over connection, obscurity over recognition. Because in his world, recognition is not validation, it is exposure. And exposure is not opportunity, it is danger. So he remains where he is, in a place that mirrors his condition, in a life that reflects his limitations, in a reality that offers no clear path forward. And as time passes, that life begins to feel complete, not because it fulfills anything within him, but because it is all he knows, all he expects, all he believes is possible. And when a person reaches that point, when they no longer look beyond what is immediately in front of them, when they no longer imagine anything different, when they no longer anticipate change, they become settled, not in peace, but in resignation, in a quiet acceptance that this is how things are and how they will remain. But what he does not know, what he cannot see, is that somewhere beyond Lodibar, beyond the life he has accepted, beyond the fear that has shaped him, there is a memory that has not faded, a promise that has not been broken, a decision that has not yet been made but is already forming. And when that decision is spoken, when that memory becomes action, when that promise is remembered, it will reach into the life of a man who has spent years avoiding attention, and it will bring attention directly to him. There is something heavier than fear, something that does not just shape how a person reacts to the world but begins to define how they see themselves within it. And that is shame, not the kind that comes from a single mistake or a moment of failure, but the kind that grows slowly, built over time through limitation, through isolation, through the quiet repetition of a life that never quite aligns with what it was supposed to be. And for Mephibosheth, shame was not something that appeared suddenly. It was something that formed gradually, almost unnoticed at first, but then deeply rooted, becoming part of the way he thought, the way he understood his place, the way he interpreted every interaction, every silence, every absence in his life. He lived in a place that did not demand attention, a place that did not offer recognition, a place that did not remind anyone of what had once been. And in that environment it became easier for him to disappear, not just physically but internally, because when a person lives long enough in a place where nothing is expected of them, where no one is looking for them, where their presence or absence changes nothing, they begin to feel that absence themselves. They begin to believe that their life does not carry weight, that it does not influence anything beyond their immediate existence, that it is small, contained, and largely unnoticed. And that belief does something. It reshapes identity, not through force, but through repetition, because every day that passes without recognition, every moment where nothing changes, every interaction that reinforces distance rather than connection adds another layer, another quiet confirmation that this is who you are, this is where you belong, this is what your life is meant to be. He was not treated as a prince. He was not addressed with honor. He was not surrounded by reminders of his past. Instead, he lived as someone who had been removed from that past, someone who existed outside of it, someone whose connection to it no longer carried visible meaning, and over time, that distance becomes more than external, it becomes internal. Because when a person is no longer treated according to who they once were or who they might have been, they begin to stop seeing themselves that way as well. He becomes smaller in his own mind, not physically, but in value, in expectation, in possibility. Because what evidence is there to suggest anything else? His body limits him. His past isolates him. His environment reinforces both. And so the identity that forms is not one of strength or potential, but one of reduction, of narrowing, of becoming less than what was once possible, less than what might have been imagined. He begins to measure himself differently, not by what he can achieve, but by what he lacks. Not by what he might become, but by what he cannot change. And that shift is subtle, but powerful, because once a person begins to define themselves by limitation, it becomes difficult to see beyond it. Difficult to imagine a version of life that is not shaped by the same boundaries. Difficult to believe that anything different could exist. He sees others. He sees what they can do. He sees how they move, how they live, how they interact, how they carry themselves. And in those observations, the contrast becomes clear, not always spoken, not always acknowledged, but always present. And that contrast feeds the sense of difference, the sense of separation, the sense that he does not belong in the same way, that his life operates under a different set of rules, a different set of expectations, a different reality entirely. And over time, that difference becomes shame. Not because he has done something wrong, but because he feels like something is wrong with him. Because he cannot separate his condition from his identity. Because he cannot fully distinguish between what happened to him and who he is. And so the two become intertwined. He is not just someone who cannot walk. He is someone who sees himself as less. He is not just someone who lives in hiding. He is someone who believes he belongs there. He is not just someone connected to a fallen house. He is someone who feels the weight of that fall as part of himself, and in that internalization, something begins to close, possibility, expectation, hope, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, as the same patterns repeat, as the same limitations persist, as nothing appears to challenge the reality he has come to accept. Because hope requires contrast. It requires something that suggests change is possible, something that interrupts the pattern, something that introduces a different outcome. And without that, hope begins to fade, not dramatically, but quietly, becoming less present, less active, less influential in the way a person thinks about their future. He does not expect to be restored. He does not expect to be remembered. He does not expect to be called, because nothing in his life suggests that those things are possible. And so he settles. Not in peace, but in acceptance, a quiet, heavy acceptance that this is what his life is, and what it will remain. And that acceptance is not freedom, it is limitation, because it removes the possibility of something more. It confines his thinking to what he has already experienced. It prevents him from imagining anything beyond the boundaries that have defined him for so long. And yet, even in that state, even in that reduced sense of self, even in a life that feels fixed and unchangeable, there are things that exist beyond his awareness, things that are not influenced by his perception, things that are not limited by his understanding, because while he has come to see himself in a certain way, while he has accepted a certain version of reality, there are forces outside of that perception that are still moving, still shaping, still preparing something he cannot yet see, because identity, as powerful as it is not always final. It can be challenged, it can be interrupted, it can be redefined, but that redefinition rarely begins from within. It begins from outside, from something unexpected, something unearned, something that does not align with what a person believes about themselves. And when that moment comes, it does not simply adjust how a person lives. It confronts everything they have come to believe about who they are. But before that moment arrives, before anything changes, before any voice calls his name, Mephibosheth remains where he has always been, hidden, limited, forgotten, and convinced that this is all his life will ever be. There are moments when everything begins to change, not because of anything the person at the center has done, not because they have prepared for it or earned it or even imagined it, but because somewhere else, beyond their awareness, a decision is made, a memory is awakened, a promise that seemed distant suddenly becomes active again. And for Mephibosheth, that moment did not begin in Lodibar. It did not begin in his thoughts or in his expectations, because he had long since stopped expecting anything to change. It began in the mind of a king, in a place of power, in a position he could never reach, in a world that felt completely separate from his own. And that is what makes what happens next so unexpected, because it does not follow the logic of his life. It does not align with the patterns he has come to accept. It does not move in a way that he could have predicted. David sat as king, established, secure. The battles that once defined his rise had passed. The instability of transition had settled. He was no longer the man running from Saul, no longer the one hiding in caves, no longer the one surviving from moment to moment to moment. He was now the one in control, the one who determined outcomes, the one who held authority over the nation, and in that position, he had the power to shape what came next, not just for himself, but for others, including those connected to the past he had replaced. And it would have been easy to forget. Easy to move forward without looking back. Easy to leave behind everything associated with Saul's house, not out of hatred but out of practicality, because the past often becomes less relevant as new structures are built, new priorities are established, new directions are set. And yet, something interrupted that natural progression. Something surfaced that did not allow the past to remain buried. A question, simple, direct, but powerful enough to shift everything. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness? That question does not come from obligation. It does not come from pressure. It comes from memory, from a promise that had been made years earlier, not in a moment of power, but in a moment of loyalty, of friendship, of covenant between David and Jonathan, a promise that extended beyond their own lives, beyond their own circumstances, into the future, into a time when one would no longer be present to remind the other. And yet, even in that distance, even after everything that had happened, that promise had not disappeared. David remembered, not just the words, but the person. Jonathan, a friend who had stood beside him when others did not. A man who had chosen loyalty over position, who had recognized something in David that went beyond the politics of succession, who had made a covenant that was not based on convenience but on something deeper, something that held even when circumstances changed. And now, years later, that memory returned, not as nostalgia but as action, because memory alone does not change anything. It is what is done with it that matters. And David chose to act. He did not assume that no one remained. He did not dismiss the possibility. He asked, he searched. He opened the question into the present, into reality, into something that required an answer. And that question moved outward, through servants, through the structure of the kingdom, until it reached someone who knew Ziba, a servant of Saul's household, a man who carried knowledge of what remained, of who had survived, of what had been left behind after the fall. And when he was brought before the king, the weight of that question became immediate. because answering it was not neutral. It carried implications. It could change lives. It could shift attention toward someone who had been hidden for years. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul? And the answer came, yes. A single word that carried years of silence within it. Yes, there is still a son of Jonathan. And then the detail that defines everything. He is crippled in his feet. That description is not incidental. It is not unnecessary. It reveals how Mephibosheth is known, not first by his name, not first by his lineage, but by his limitation, by the condition that has defined his life since childhood, the reality that has shaped how others see him, how they describe him, how they identify him. And in that moment, that identity reaches the ears of the king, not as a full picture of who he is, but as a fragment, a detail that highlights weakness, vulnerability, difference. And yet David does not hesitate. He does not reconsider. He does not withdraw the question. He does not shift his intention. Because the promise he remembers is not dependent on condition. It is not altered by limitation. It is not reduced by circumstance. It remains what it was, a commitment to show kindness. And so he asks the next question. Where is he? Location matters, because location determines access, and access determines what happens next. And the answer places Mephibosheth exactly where his life has led him. In Lo-debar, a place of obscurity, a place of distance, a place where people are not expected to be found. And now he is found, not by accident, not by chance, but by intention, by a decision that began with a memory and moved into action, reaching across distance, across time, across the separation between a king and a man who has spent years living as though he no longer belonged to the world of kings. And in that moment, everything begins to shift, not visibly yet, not in his life directly, because he does not know. He is still in Lo-debar, still living the same way, still thinking the same thoughts, still expecting nothing beyond what he has already experienced. But something has already changed. The direction of his life has been altered before he even becomes aware of it, because the king has spoken, the king has remembered, the king has decided, and decisions made in places of power have a way of moving quickly, of reaching into places that feel distant, of pulling people out of circumstances they believed were permanent. Messengers are sent, instructions are given, movement begins. And somewhere, in the quiet obscurity of Lo-debar, a man who has built his life around staying unnoticed is about to be noticed in the most direct way possible, not by rumor, not by coincidence, but by command. And that kind of attention is not something he is prepared for, because for years, attention has meant danger, recognition has meant risk, being found has meant exposure, and now he is about to be found by the king. And in that moment, before he understands why, before he hears the reason, before he knows anything about the promise that has been remembered, one thought will rise above everything else. Not hope, not relief, but fear, because when a man who has spent his life hiding is suddenly called into the presence of a king, he does not expect mercy, he expects the end. There are moments when everything a person has built their life around is suddenly disrupted, not gradually, not in a way that allows adjustment, but all at once, in a single interruption that forces them out of what is familiar and into something they cannot control. And for Mephibosheth, that moment did not come with explanation. It did not come with reassurance. It came as a command, direct and unavoidable, a message that reached into the quiet obscurity of Lo-debar and shattered the pattern he had come to depend on. Because for years, his survival had been built on one principle: remain unseen, remain unnoticed, remain outside the awareness of those who hold power. And now, without warning, that principle no longer protected him, because the one who held power had become aware of him, had spoken his existence into action, had sent for him specifically, and there is no way to ignore a command from a king. The message arrived, not as a suggestion, not as an invitation, but as an order. He was to come immediately. There was no space to negotiate, no opportunity to delay, no explanation offered that might soften what it meant. And in that absence of information, the mind does what it always does when faced with uncertainty shaped by fear. It fills the gap with the most likely outcome based on everything it has learned, everything it has experienced, everything it understands about the world it lives in. And for Mephibosheth, that understanding had been shaped by years of caution, by the knowledge that his name carried risk, by the reality that he belonged to a line that had been replaced. And in that context, being summoned by the king does not suggest kindness, it suggests judgment. He did not prepare with hope. He prepared with expectation of loss. Because what other reason could there be? Why would the king seek him out after all this time? Why now? Why him? These are not questions that lead to comfort, they lead to fear. Because when a person has lived long enough in hiding, when they have structured their life around avoiding attention, the sudden arrival of attention feels like exposure, like something has gone wrong, like the protection they relied on has failed, and now they must face whatever comes next without the ability to escape it. He was taken, not carried in the same way as before, not as a child fleeing danger, but as a man being brought toward it, moving not by his own decision but by the will of another, by the authority of a king whose intentions he did not understand, whose reasons had not been explained, whose power could not be resisted. And that movement, from the place where he had hidden for so long toward the center of power, is more than physical, it is psychological. It is the transition from obscurity to visibility, from safety to exposure, from a life that had been contained and predictable into one that is suddenly uncertain and uncontrollable. Every step toward the palace carried weight, not just in distance but in meaning. Because each moment brought him closer to an outcome he could not change, closer to a confrontation he could not avoid, closer to a reality that would either confirm his fears or reveal something he had never considered possible. But at that point, there was no reason to believe in anything beyond what he already knew, no reason to expect anything other than what the world had already shown him, and so the closer he came, the more his thoughts would narrow, focusing not on possibilities, but on inevitability. He would stand before the king, and whatever the king decided would happen. There would be no appeal, no negotiation, no second chance, because kings do not summon people like him without purpose, and purpose, in situations like this, is rarely favorable for those who stand on the weaker side of power. When he arrived, everything he had imagined began to take form. The palace, the structure, the presence of authority that cannot be ignored. This was a world he had been removed from, a world that no longer belonged to him, a world that represented everything he had lost and everything he had learned to live without, and now he stood within it again, not as a prince returning, not as someone reclaiming anything, but as someone being brought in to face whatever decision had already been made about him. And then, he was brought before David the king, the man who had replaced his grandfather, the one whose rise had followed the fall of his family, the one whose position now held the power to determine whether he would live or die. There is a moment, in situations like this, where everything becomes still, not externally, but internally, where the mind stops searching for alternatives, where the body prepares for what it believes is coming, where the only response left is submission, because resistance is not possible, escape is not possible, change is not possible. And in that moment, Mephibosheth did what anyone in his position would do. He fell. Not by accident, not by weakness but by recognition, by understanding, by the acknowledgement of authority, of power, of his own position within that structure. Because to stand would be inappropriate, to speak without permission would be dangerous, to do anything other than submit completely would risk accelerating whatever judgment had already been decided. He bowed low, his face to the ground, a posture of surrender, a posture of humility. A posture that reflects not just respect, but awareness, the awareness that he holds no power in this moment, no control, no influence over what comes next. And then his name was spoken, Mephibosheth, not as a label, not as a description, but as a name. And that matters because names carry identity. They acknowledge existence. They recognize the person beyond the condition. But in that moment, that recognition does not yet bring comfort, because it comes from the one who holds his fate, and hearing your name spoken by someone with that level of authority does not immediately remove fear. It intensifies it. It confirms that this is real, that this is happening, that there is no misunderstanding, no confusion, no chance that he has been brought here by mistake. And his response is immediate. Here is your servant, not here I am, not spoken with confidence or familiarity, but with submission, with distance, with the language of someone who understands his position, who does not assume anything beyond survival, who does not presume favor, who does not expect anything except to endure what comes next. He does not defend himself. He does not explain his past. He does not attempt to justify his existence. Because in his mind, none of that would change the outcome. If the king has decided, then the decision stands. And in that moment, everything he has lived with for years, the fear, the shame, the limitation, the expectation of being less, all of it converges into a single point, a single moment where it will either be confirmed or shattered, because this is the moment where his life, as he understands it, meets something greater than it, something outside of it, something that has the power to redefine everything he believes about himself, but he does not know that yet. All he knows is that he stands before a king, and he is waiting for the judgment to fall. There is a moment, just before something changes, where everything still feels certain, where the outcome seems already decided, where the weight of expectation presses so heavily that no other possibility can be imagined. And for Mephibosheth, that moment existed in the silence between his words and the king's response. A silence filled not with peace, but with anticipation, with the quiet tension of someone who believes they already know what is coming, because his entire life had taught him what to expect, had shown him how the world works, had reinforced the idea that people like him, people in his position, people connected to a fallen house and marked by weakness, do not stand before kings and walk away unchanged, and certainly not for the better. He had lowered himself, he had spoken as a servant, he had done everything required in a moment where survival depended on submission, and now he waited, not for mercy, but for confirmation, for the outcome that made sense, for the end that felt inevitable. Because when fear shapes expectation for long enough, it becomes difficult to imagine anything else, difficult to believe that the pattern could break, that the direction could shift, that the moment could unfold in a way that does not align with everything that has come before. And then the king spoke. Do not be afraid. Words that do not match the moment. Words that interrupt expectation. Words that create a pause, not because they are fully understood, but because they do not fit, because they do not align with what he has prepared himself to hear. And when something does not fit the pattern, the mind does not immediately accept it. It hesitates, it questions, it waits for clarification, because it expects the familiar, not the unexpected. Do not be afraid. The very thing he had been carrying, the very thing that had defined his life, the very thing that had brought him to this moment, addressed directly, not ignored, not dismissed, but spoken into. And before he can fully process what that means, before he can adjust his understanding, before he can shift his expectation, the king continues, for I will surely show you kindness. Kindness, a word that has not been part of his reality, a word that does not belong to the situation he believes he is in, a word that feels out of place, almost impossible, because kindness is not what he has prepared for, not what he has expected, not what his life has conditioned him to receive, and yet it is spoken, clearly, intentionally, without hesitation, for the sake of your father, Jonathan. And suddenly, there is context, there is reason, there is something that reaches beyond him, beyond his condition, beyond his fear, beyond everything he has come to believe about himself. Something that is not based on what he has done or who he has become, but on a relationship that existed before all of this, a promise that was made before his life took the shape it did, a connection that he did not create, that he did not maintain, that he may not have even fully understood, and yet it is that connection that now defines what is happening in this moment. Not his weakness, not his past, not his hiding, but a promise. And before he can respond, before he can even begin to process the shift that is taking place, the king speaks again, not with vague assurance, not with general kindness, but with specific action. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. Restore, not give, restore, which means something that was lost is being returned, something that had been taken or abandoned or removed is being placed back into his possession, something that connects him again to a past he thought was completely gone, completely inaccessible, completely beyond recovery. And then the words that change everything: and you shall always eat at my table, not once, not occasionally, always, which means not as a visitor, not as an outsider, but as someone who belongs, someone who is brought into proximity, someone who is given a place, not based on ability, not based on status, not based on merit, but based on a decision made by the king, a decision that overrides everything else, that redefines his position completely. And in that moment, everything he believed begins to collapse, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, because nothing in his life has prepared him for this. Nothing in his experience has suggested that this is possible. Nothing in his identity has made room for this kind of outcome. And when reality does not match expectation, when something unfolds in a way that contradicts everything a person believes about themselves, the response is not immediate confidence. It is confusion. It is disbelief. It is the inability to fully grasp what is being offered because it does not fit within the framework that has been built over years of limitation and fear. He responds, but not with acceptance, not with gratitude in the way one might expect. He bows again, and his words reveal everything. What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? Dead dog, not just humility, not just respect, but identity, because this is how he sees himself, not as a prince, not as a son of Jonathan, not as someone worthy of restoration, but as something low, something insignificant, something without value, something that exists beneath notice, beneath consideration, beneath expectation. And this is the contrast. This is the tension between how he sees himself and how the king sees him. Because the king does not respond to that statement by agreeing. He does not reinforce that identity. He does not correct it directly. Instead, he acts. He calls Ziba. He gives instructions, clear, immediate, unquestionable. Everything that belonged to Saul is now Mephibosheth's. Servants are assigned. Land is restored. Provision is secured, not as a possibility, not as something that might happen, but as something that is already decided, already established, already in motion. And at the center of it all is a seat at the king's table, a place that changes everything, because tables are not just about food. They are about belonging, about proximity, about identity, about who is allowed to sit near the king, who is recognized, who is seen, who is included. And Mephibosheth, the one who could not walk, the one who lived in hiding, the one who believed he was nothing, is now placed in a position where he will be seen daily, where he will exist within the presence of power, where he will be treated not according to his limitation, but according to a decision that overrides it completely. And nothing about this is earned. Nothing about this is expected. Nothing about this follows the logic of his life. It is not the result of effort, not the outcome of achievement, not the reward for perseverance. It is given freely, unexpectedly, completely, and that is what makes it so difficult to understand. Because when a person has lived within limitation for so long, when they have defined themselves by what they lack, when they have accepted a version of reality that offers no indication of change, receiving something that contradicts all of that does not immediately feel natural. It feels overwhelming. It feels undeserved. It feels undeserved. It feels almost impossible to fully accept. And yet it is real. It is happening. It is unfolding in front of him. Not as a possibility, but as a new reality. A reality that does not erase his past, does not remove his condition, does not change what happened to him, but changes what happens next. Because from this moment forward, he will no longer live in Lodibar. He will no longer exist in hiding. He will no longer be defined only by what he cannot do. He will live in the presence of the king. He will eat at the king's table. He will carry a new identity that does not come from within him, but is given to him. And that kind of change does not just alter circumstances. It challenges everything a person believes about who they are. Because when mercy arrives in a life that has only known limitation, it does not simply add something new. It replaces the foundation entirely. Change does not always feel like change. Not immediately, not in the way people expect, because while circumstances can shift in a moment, identity often lags behind, shaped by years of experience that do not disappear simply because something new has been given. And for Mephibosheth, the transition from Lodibar to the king's table was not just a change of location. It was a collision between two realities, one that had defined him for most of his life and one that had just been placed upon him without warning, without preparation, without any gradual movement in between. And when those two realities meet, they do not blend easily. They exist in tension, pulling in different directions, creating a space where a person must learn how to live with something new while still carrying everything that came before. He now lived in Jerusalem, in the presence of the king, in a place of structure, of order, of visibility, a place where names were known, where positions were recognized, where identity was not hidden but displayed, and in that environment, everything about his life appeared different, because externally it was different, dramatically so. The man who had once lived in obscurity now existed within the center of power. The one who had hidden was now seen. The one who had expected nothing now received more than he could have imagined. And yet, within him something remained unchanged. He was still the man who had learned to expect less, still the man who had defined himself by limitation, still the man who had spent years believing that his life would never move beyond what it had become. And that kind of belief does not disappear in a single moment. It does not dissolve simply because circumstances improve. It lingers, it echoes, it continues to shape how a person interprets what is happening around them. And so even as he sat at the king's table, even as he received provision, even as he was treated with honor, there would have been moments, quiet, internal moments, where the old identity surfaced, where the question remained, where the disconnect between who he had been and who he was now being treated as felt almost too great to fully reconcile. Because honor, when it is given to someone who has lived in shame, does not always feel natural. It can feel foreign, unfamiliar, even undeserved, not because it is not real, but because it does not match the internal framework that has been built over time. And when something does not match that framework, it takes time to adjust, to accept, to begin to see oneself in a way that aligns with what is now being experienced externally. He sat at the table, regularly, consistently. Not as an exception, not as a guest, but as part of the structure, part of the rhythm, part of the environment. And that repetition matters, because identity is shaped not only by what happens once, but by what happens repeatedly, by what is reinforced over time, by what becomes normal through consistency. And so each time he sat, each time he was included, each time he was treated according to the decision the king had made, something began to shift. Slowly, quietly, not all at once, but gradually, as the new reality continued to present itself. But even then, the past did not disappear. His body did not change. His legs did not heal. He still could not walk. And that is important, because it means that the transformation in his life was not physical. It was positional. It was relational. It was rooted in how he was treated rather than in what he was able to do. And that distinction carries weight, because it reveals that what changed his life was not the removal of his limitation, but the presence of something greater than it. He remained dependent. He remained limited in movement. He remained marked by the same condition that had shaped his life from childhood, and yet, he sat at the king's table, which means that his limitation did not disqualify him from presence. It did not exclude him from belonging. It did not prevent him from being included in a space that had once felt completely inaccessible. And that creates a new tension, not between fear and safety, but between limitation and acceptance, because now he must learn how to exist in a place where his weakness is visible, where it cannot be hidden, where it is present every time he enters the room, every time he takes his seat, every time others see him, and yet that visibility no longer carries the same meaning it once did. It is no longer tied to rejection, no longer linked to exclusion, no longer something that forces him into hiding. Instead, it exists within acceptance, within provision, within a decision that has already been made about him. And that changes how weakness functions in his life. It is still there, but it no longer defines the outcome. It is still visible, but it no longer determines his place. It is still real, but it no longer limits what he is allowed to receive. And that kind of shift is not easy to process, because it requires a redefinition of everything he has come to believe, not just about himself, but about how the world works, about what determines value, about what qualifies a person for inclusion or exclusion, because his entire life had taught him one pattern. Weakness leads to hiding, limitation leads to exclusion, connection to the wrong past leads to danger, and now none of those patterns apply. Not because they were entirely false, but because something greater has interrupted them, something that does not follow the same rules, something that operates outside of what he has experienced, and that something is the decision of the king, a decision that continues, that remains, that is not revoked based on performance, not altered based on perception, not reduced based on limitation, it simply stands. And in that standing, it creates a space where Mephibosheth can exist in a way he never has before, not as someone trying to survive, not as someone trying to remain unnoticed, but as someone who has been brought into a place where his presence is not only allowed but established. And yet, the question remains, not externally, but internally, who am I now? Because when identity shifts, when the foundation of how a person sees themselves is challenged, it does not immediately settle into clarity. It moves, it adjusts, it reforms over time, shaped by new experiences, reinforced by repeated reality, slowly replacing what was once believed with something that aligns more closely with what is now true. He is no longer in Lodi, but Lodibar is still in him. He is no longer hidden, but the instinct to hide does not disappear overnight. He is no longer defined only by his limitation, but the memory of being defined that way remains. And so his life becomes a process, not just of living in a new place, but of learning how to see himself in a new way, of allowing what has been given to reshape what he believes, of letting the decision of the king carry more weight than the voice of his past. And that process takes time. It unfolds in moments, in small realizations, in repeated experiences that slowly build something new, until one day, what once felt impossible feels normal, not because the past has been erased, but because it has been redefined. And that is where the transformation becomes complete, not when circumstances change, but when identity follows, when a man who once saw himself as nothing begins to live as though he belongs, not because he earned it, not because he achieved it, but because it was given to him, and he finally begins to believe it. Some stories end with resolution, with clarity, with a sense that everything has been explained and placed in its proper order. But there are other stories that do not resolve so cleanly, stories that leave something behind, something that lingers beyond the details, beyond the events, something that stays not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals. And the story of Mephibosheth belongs to that second kind, because it does not simply describe a change in circumstances. It exposes something deeper, something that challenges the way we understand value, identity, and the way lives are shaped, not only by what is lost, but by what is given. He began as a child in a royal house, not by choice, not by effort, but by birth, surrounded by structure, by expectation, by a future that seemed already defined. And then in a single moment, everything collapsed, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. And in that collapse, he lost more than position. He lost stability, he lost ability, he lost a version of life that might have unfolded if nothing had changed. And what followed was not restoration, not immediate recovery, but years of silence, of hiding, of limitation, of learning to live within boundaries that were not chosen but imposed. And in those years, something formed, something that would shape how he saw himself long before anything external changed. He learned to expect less, to remain unseen, to accept a life that felt smaller than what might have been possible. And that acceptance was not weakness, it was survival. Because when a person lives long enough in a reality that offers no alternative, they adapt to it, they shape themselves around it. They build a life within it, even if that life is defined more by what is missing than by what is present. And then everything changed, not because he changed it, not because he worked toward it, not because he even imagined it, but because someone else remembered, because a promise made years earlier did not disappear with time, did not fade with distance, did not lose its weight, even after the circumstances that surrounded it had completely shifted. And when that promise was remembered, it did not remain an idea. It became action. It moved. It reached into a life that had been built around obscurity, and it pulled that life into the center of something entirely new. And this is where the story begins to challenge expectation, because what happened next does not follow the logic of fairness as it is often understood. It does not align with the idea that outcomes are earned, that positions are deserved, that what a person receives is directly connected to what they have done. Because Mephibosheth did nothing to create the change that came into his life. He did not position himself for it. He did not prepare for it. He did not even expect it. And yet, he became the recipient of something that redefined everything. He was restored. Not partially, not conditionally, but completely, in ways that affected not only his provision but his position, his identity, his place within the structure of the kingdom. And at the center of that restoration was something simple, yet profound: a seat at the king's table, a place that signified more than access to food, more than physical presence. It represented belonging, recognition, acceptance, a redefinition of who he was within the context of everything that had come before. And yet his condition did not change. His legs were not healed. His limitation remained, which means that what changed his life was not the removal of weakness, but the presence of grace, something that did not ignore his limitation, but operated beyond it. Something that did not require him to become different in order to be accepted, but accepted him fully within the reality he already lived in. And that is what makes this story difficult to dismiss, because it forces a question not about what he deserved, but about what was given. Because if his life had continued the way it began, if he had remained in Lodibar, if he had lived and died in obscurity, defined by limitation and shaped by loss, it would have made sense. It would have aligned with the pattern. It would have followed the logic of his circumstances. But that is not how his story ends, and that difference reveals something that goes beyond him. It reveals that outcomes are not always determined by beginnings, that identity is not always fixed by past events, that limitation does not always define the final position, because there are moments when something greater intervenes, something that does not follow the same rules, something that is not constrained by what has already happened, something that has the power to redefine a life completely. And yet, even in that redefinition, the past is not erased. It is carried, integrated, remembered, but no longer allowed to determine everything, because Mephibosheth did not become someone else. He remained who he was, a man marked by a fall, a man shaped by years of hiding, a man who had lived within limitation. But now, he lived in the presence of the king, and that presence changed what those things meant, not by removing them, but by placing them within a different context, a context where they no longer defined his worth, no longer determined his place, no longer limited what he was allowed to receive. And that shift is what gives the story its weight, because it moves beyond history, beyond narrative, into something that reflects a deeper reality about how lives can change, not always through effort, not always through correction, but through something that is given freely, something that arrives without being earned, something that arrives the expected outcome and replaces it with something entirely different. And that kind of change is difficult to accept, because it challenges the idea that everything must be deserved, that every outcome must be justified, that every position must be earned. But Mephibosheth's story does not operate within that framework. It operates within a different one where a promise holds power beyond time, where memory leads to action, where a king chooses to extend kindness not based on qualification, but on commitment. And when that happens, everything changes, not just externally, but internally, because the greatest transformation in his life was not the restoration of land, not the provision of servants, not even the seat at the table. It was the shift in identity, from someone who believed he was nothing, to someone who lived as though he belonged. And that shift does not happen instantly. It unfolds, it grows, it takes time. But once it begins, it cannot be undone, because it is rooted not in what he believes about himself, but in what has been declared over him. And that is what makes the story remain. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is unusual, but because it reveals something that continues beyond it, that a life can be shaped by loss, defined by limitation, hidden in obscurity, and still be completely changed by a grace no one expected.